Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
They brushed off my birthday like always, with the same casual wave of indifference that had followed me since childhood, but this time it felt heavier, more suffocating. Like I was watching the same scene play out for the 100th time, yet realizing suddenly how grotesque it really was, and how foolish I had been to keep playing my assigned role. My parents sent me a short, almost perfunctory text in the morning, the kind of message you send to a coworker or a distant acquaintance when Facebook reminds you of their birthday, and while I should have expected nothing more, it still stung to see how little effort they cared to put into even pretending that I mattered. I didn't get a call. I didn't get an invitation to dinner. And I certainly didn't get the feeling that I was loved or celebrated. Instead, I scrolled back through years of messages and noticed the pattern, the stark contrast between how they treated me and how they treated Emily, my younger sister, who somehow managed to be the star of the family from the day she was born, soaking up every ounce of attention, every ounce of money, every ounce of effort that I could never seem to be worth. I used to tell myself that it was just the way things were, that maybe I was too independent, too quiet, too much in the background to make celebrating me seem worthwhile, but looking back, I realized that was the story I invented to make the imbalance less painful, because the truth was much simpler and much harsher. They just didn't value me the way they valued her. I remember being a kid and watching Emily get balloons, cakes, and entire parties where half the neighborhood was invited, while my own birthday was either forgotten because my dad had an urgent meeting or dismissed because my mom said money was tight that year. It wasn't that we didn't have the money, though, because only a week or two later there would be some huge purchase for Emily, a trip, a new outfit, or some piece of expensive equipment for whatever hobby she had picked up that season. It was almost comical how consistently the scale tipped in her direction, as if the universe itself had been designed to give her everything and leave me with scraps. As I got older, I thought maybe things would even out, that adulthood would force my parents to treat us both like grown women rather than competing children, but the pattern never changed. When I graduated college, I got a half-hearted card and a cheap dinner out, while Emily's graduation was a full production, with relatives flying in, photo shoots, expensive gifts, and endless bragging about how proud everyone was. I convinced myself to be the bigger person, to be the one who shrugged it off, because I didn't want to look bitter or jealous, but inside, it built up like layers of sediment, each year adding another weight on my chest that made it harder to breathe. So when this year rolled around and my birthday arrived, I thought, maybe stupidly, that they might surprise me, that after all the years of watching me stay quiet and loyal, they'd finally see that I deserved at least a fraction of the effort they poured into Emily. I woke up, checked my phone, and saw that one text. Just one. Happy birthday, have a great day. Nothing else. No call, no dinner plans, no sign that I mattered enough to take up space on their calendar. Emily didn't even bother to send a message until the evening, and even then it was just a lazy happy birthday that she probably copy-pasted while sitting at dinner with her friends. That night, I sat alone, scrolling through social media, watching other people my age posting pictures with their families, blowing out candles, opening gifts, smiling with people who at least made the effort to pretend their presence mattered. I tried to ignore the ache in my chest, tried to remind myself that I didn't care about birthdays, that it wasn't about the party or the gifts, but about the acknowledgement that you're not invisible in your own family. Yet, it was impossible to convince myself, because deep down I did care, and I couldn't stop replaying every moment in my head, asking myself why I kept showing up for them when they never showed up for me. It would have been easy to just swallow it again, to file the memory away with all the others, and wake up the next day ready to keep pretending. But something shifted that night. Maybe it was because I was older now and finally understood that they weren't going to change, or maybe it was because the loneliness felt sharper than usual. But I remember lying in bed and realizing with sudden clarity that the dynamic wasn't just unfair, it was cruel. They weren't just neglectful, they were intentional in how they chose to make me less, how they actively invested all their time, money, and pride into Emily while leaving me as the afterthought. And for the first time, I wasn't content to accept it. The irony, though, is that if it had just ended with my forgotten birthday, I probably still would have swallowed it because that's what I had always done. I would have told myself to move on, to not stir the pot, to just focus on my own life and let it go. But only a few days later, when I saw the invitations for Emily's party, her massive, over-the-top, borderline ridiculous celebration, I understood that this year was different. I wasn't going to let it slide, and I wasn't going to smile politely while they rubbed salt in the wound yet again. This was the year that something inside me broke, and I knew in that moment that nothing between us would ever be the same again. I woke the next morning determined to be practical and even-tempered, telling myself that grown people do not need candles or fanfare to feel seen, and that I could let the slight pass like I always did. Yet the longer I looked at that single-line message on my phone, the more I felt a steady heat rise that was not jealousy and not melodrama, but the plain ache of understanding that I had been assigned the role of background furniture in a family that only rearranged itself for my sister, and in that clear and uncomfortable moment I decided I would no longer cooperate with a story that kept me quiet, agreeable, and endlessly available. By late afternoon, my aunt called with the cheerful voice she uses when she is smoothing over something everyone else is ignoring, asking what time she and the cousins should arrive because she did not want to be late. And when I told her there was nothing to be late for, she paused just a little too long before telling me she must have mixed things up, then slipped and asked whether the caterer had confirmed for Thursday because she heard my mother was worried about the tasting and the photographer, and it landed with a thud that the week that began with my birthday would end with a lavish production for Emily, which meant there had always been time and money and planning energy. It had simply never been meant for me. I hung up and sat very still with the kind of clarity that does not shout but settles like a verdict, because the details finally connected in a way I could not unsee. From the quick text in the morning to the secret vendor calls at midday to the cheerful anticipation around a party I had not even been told about, and it was so obvious I felt foolish for ever arguing with myself about whether I was overreacting. Since the truth was simple and blunt, they did not forget me by accident. They chose me last on purpose. I spent the next hour doing what I had avoided for years because it made me feel petty, walking through every memory of me stepping in without being asked, the rides to appointments, the airport pickups, the last-minute decorations that made other people's photos look curated, the errands that shaved time off my workday, the holidays I hosted because no one else wanted the hassle. And as I counted, I felt the anger stop waving its arms and instead sit down at the table like a quiet advisor who only says one thing: stop feeding what starves you. So I opened the settings on the shared subscriptions I had been covering out of habit and removed my card from autopay. And I canceled the recurring grocery delivery I had scheduled for my parents on the 1st of every month because they always forgot and then thanked me casually as if the bags had floated to their doorstep on their own. And I took myself off the family calendar I had created and maintained even though I was the one most often left off in bites, and I archived the shared album that I kept curating so other people's milestones would look polished while mine were a single blurry slice of cake bought at the last minute. Right then the group chat lit up with a photo of place cards and a color board my sister said she was considering for a special event. No explanation needed, and I typed a response that was not cruel and not dramatic but very clear, telling everyone I appreciated the birthday message and would not be available for any parties or planning sessions this week because I had plans of my own. And then I added that going forward I was stepping back from being the point person for family logistics, because it had never really been my job, which sparked the predictable blend of guilt and outrage. The "you know how busy we are and the you are always so organized and the can you just finish this last thing since you already started." I let the messages pile up until Emily texted me privately with the breezy entitlement that always rubbed me raw, asking if I could pick up her dress and handle the favors because the planner was behind and she knew I would do it right. And I answered with a calm sentence I wish I had discovered years ago: I am not available. And when she pushed with the familiar line about family pulling together, I told her that I had spent years pulling and that I was done being the rope, which earned me a long paragraph about how I was making things difficult on purpose, a paragraph I read once and refused to reread. When evening settled and the silence from my parents hardened into that old ache, I opened the electronic invitation that a cousin finally forwarded with a casual "you probably already have this," and I used the response option that allowed a public note. And I selected decline and wrote a courteous message wishing my sister a beautiful celebration and thanking everyone for including me, then added a single sentence that landed exactly where I wanted it to land. "This year I am celebrating myself by not volunteering for anything that erases me." The effect was instant in the only way that matters with people who never notice until you remove the service they have mistaken for love, because within minutes the calendar dropped the events I had been propping up. The recurring orders sent out cancellation notices with my name at the bottom. The chat spun into confusion about who would handle what now that the invisible hands had stepped away, and as my phone began to buzz with calls from my mother, a string of texts from my father, and a new number labeled event coordinator trying to confirm that I was still the contact for half their arrangements, I watched it ring and felt something solid click into place. Not a scream and not a threat. Just the first clean move in a game I had never allowed myself to play. By the time the weekend rolled around, the machine was humming so loudly that even people who are not usually invited into family business could hear it, with the planner sending group updates about headcounts and place settings, and the florist confirming that an arch would be delivered the morning of, while my parents chirped to relatives about how wonderful it felt to bring everyone together for an occasion that truly mattered, and I sat with that phrasing for a long minute because although they did not mean it as a knife, it fit like one. Which is exactly why I refused to dull it with another round of self-help pep talks about not taking things personally and instead let it do the honest work of clarifying where I stood in a house that seemed permanently arranged to look perfect around everyone but me. I had already stepped back from the hidden jobs and the auto payments and the quiet calendar maintenance that smoothed their lives without ever being named, and it was almost funny how quickly the absence of that invisible labor turned into frantic phone calls that tried to dress themselves up as concern, with my mother insisting that she just wanted to check on me while immediately pivoting to whether the favor tags had been printed, and my father asking if I was coming because it would look odd if I did not. A phrase that told me exactly how deep the concern ran and who it was for. I kept my answers polite, long enough to block the usual manipulations and clear enough to leave no footholds, telling them I wished everyone well and that I was not available to coordinate, assist, arrive early, stay late, or otherwise do the unseen tasks they had come to treat as my personality. And when my mother reminded me in that soft tone that family shows up, I said yes, family does. And then I stopped talking before I explained the obvious difference between showing up to be part of something and showing up to carry it. When the coordinator texted a cheerful confirmation to me, because my number was still sitting on every vendor sheet from years of being the person who answered at dawn and midnight, I did something that felt small and huge at the same time, which was to reply with a brief professional line removing myself as the point of contact and directing all questions to my parents, and then I followed that with a second step that I knew would be read as hostile when it was actually simple housekeeping. Calling each vendor and asking them to update the contract files so that remaining balances could no longer be charged to the card on file because the card belonged to me and I was not authorizing further charges for an event I was not hosting. And although I kept my tone measured and calm, the effect ran through the system like a pulled thread because within an hour the caterer sent a revised invoice marked due on delivery. The venue asked for a new certificate of insurance since the original one sat under my name from an earlier event template, and the rental company flagged the order as pending until a new payment method appeared, which meant that everyone who had relied on my autopilot to hold up the tent now had to step under it themselves and feel the weight I had been carrying while they critiqued the centerpiece height. My phone started to blink with a mix that would have been entertaining if it had not been so familiar. My father escalating in clipped messages about how I was making this difficult on purpose, and my mother sending long paragraphs about how she wished I had told her I felt hurt before choosing this moment to embarrass the family. And my sister landing hardest with a line about how I was jealous and needed to grow up, at which I finally decided silence was the only adult in the room and put the device face down, because there is no winning a debate with people who mistake your oxygen for their birthright. I learned more about the party from the cousins' posts than I ever would have from the people involved, and even though I kept my promise to myself not to perform the pain by doom scrolling, I could not help noticing the scale of it in the bare-bones way that budget and effort always show themselves. The rented space with a backdrop that had the family name spelled out like a brand, the open bar wristbands, the dessert table spread that a local bakery had to assemble on site, the step and repeat that shouted sponsorship energy even though this was just a birthday, and the predictably long caption under a photo of my parents and my sister that emphasized how proud they were of her, how she deserved everything, and how family is everything. Which is a line that people who do not keep score love to post because they have never had to look at the scoreboard. I did not go, obviously, and I did not send a gift, and I did not text a second round of congratulations to soften my absence. But I did do one more thing that felt surgical and clean, which was to answer the messages from extended relatives who reached out privately with a steady script that never changed from person to person, telling them I appreciated the concern and that I was taking some space because being routinely sidelined had finally moved from uncomfortable to untenable, and then I added a line that turned out to be the most powerful boundary I have ever used, which was to ask them kindly to direct any questions about the event or family matters to my parents, because I was no longer the person who handled those logistics, and the interesting part was not that people wrote back with empathy or gossip, which they did, but that several of them apparently forwarded my note to my parents, which shifted the social pressure right where it belonged. As the evening unfolded without me, the scramble I had predicted played itself out in miniature crises that did not require me to gloat or even to know the details, because the facts made a tidy little chain all on their own. The rental company holding back the photo booth until a balance cleared, the venue manager refusing to unlock the side room until a new insurance certificate arrived, the baker waiting for a signed receipt that my mother had never had to sign before because I had always signed it, and the planner doing that brittle laugh she does when she has to pretend nothing is wrong while frantically whispering into a headset because the people who wanted a flawless show had discovered that the person they treated like backstage staff had left the building and taken her quiet competence with her. I heard about the awkward toast that came late because the band's schedule got thrown off, and I heard about the subtle argument near the bar that my cousin swore was about the invoice folder, and I also heard about my sister crying in the restroom and saying I had ruined her night, which I will admit landed with a complicated combination of sadness and relief. Sadness, because I do not enjoy hurting anyone, and relief, because she had finally felt the edge I had been rubbing against for years. I did not post a thing. I did not send a gotcha. I did not even call a friend to narrate it in real time, because the win was not in humiliating them in public, but in refusing to be humiliated in private on demand. And the only message I sent that night was one line I typed into the family group chat after the last vendor had likely been paid and the mess had been cleaned and the polite captions were being polished, where I wrote that I hoped everyone had a wonderful evening and that going forward all contracts, contacts, and costs needed to live with the people who enjoyed the benefits, and then I muted the thread and sat back in the quiet of my apartment feeling the kind of steady, grown power that does not need applause to know it is real, while a single thought settled like a marker on the table, that if they thought this was dramatic, they had not yet understood that I had only just begun. The morning after the party arrived with the predictable chorus of missed calls and drafted narratives, my mother leaving careful voicemails about wanting to clear the air while slipping in sideways questions about vendor receipts. My father texting me 3 times in a row asking whether I realized how my absence had looked to the family. And my sister sending a paragraph that started with "I cannot believe you did this to me" and ended with a threat to block me if I did not apologize by noon. And instead of stepping into their rhythm and explaining myself until my own voice sounded like a defense attorney pleading for a lesser charge, I opened a blank document and wrote a single plain statement at the top, that I was done participating in a system where my effort was invisible and my presence was optional, and that from that day forward I would only engage in relationships where care moved in both directions and respect was not something I had to earn with labor. I copied that sentence into an email addressed to my parents and my sister, and I added clear terms that did not invite debate, telling them that for the next 30 days I would not take calls or unannounced visits, that all communication needed to be in writing, that I would not accept deliveries at my door or emergency requests that magically appeared 5 minutes before a deadline, and that any attempt to contact my employer or to stage a public confrontation would be treated as harassment and handled accordingly. Which sounded harsh even to me until I remembered how many times a gentle hint had been swallowed by their appetite for convenience. Once I sent the email, I opened my bank records with the kind of steady attention that grows in the quiet after a storm, scrolling through years of charges that I had always rationalized as what family does, the floral rush orders, the down payments to hold venues, the recurring deliveries I set to my parents' address because they never managed the timing, the last-minute flights for cousins that I booked and fronted and never invoiced because someone had to get it done, and I built a ledger. That did not aim to humiliate anyone but simply to make the math visible, grouping expenses by event and by recipient, noting the dates and the explanation that lived in my memory because I had been the only one who had bothered to keep track. I did not add punitive fees or try to make the total shocking. I added a modest share of the costs that had clearly been intended for my parents, and I split the discretionary extras that had been justified as being for all of us when they had really functioned as upgrades for my sister, and I calculated a total that I could read without flinching, then wrote a short, calm note at the top that said I was not demanding back pay for love or childhood or every slight. But I was asking for reimbursement for adult expenses that had been treated as mine simply because I would not drop the ball, and that repayment in a simple monthly plan over the next year would be acceptable if a lump sum felt difficult, which meant there was no emergency. Attached, only a requirement that the debt could no longer live inside my chest. I attached the ledger to a fresh email. I copied the family accountant who had once praised me for being the only one who sent receipts, and I pressed send with a steadier hand than I thought I would have. Then I moved through the rest of my life with the same practical lens, visiting human resources to replace my emergency contacts with a friend who actually shows up. Changing beneficiaries so that the savings I've built would not be channeled through people who count my effort only when it serves them. Removing my card from the family storage unit I had been covering and scheduling a time to pick up the few boxes that actually belonged to me, and placing a freeze on my credit because history has taught me that when people feel cornered they sometimes sign your name to things without asking, a lesson learned not from malice, but from a lifetime of being treated as the dependable infrastructure that no one bothers to respect. I messaged my building and told them not to allow surprise visitors past the lobby without my written approval. I collected the spare key I had once handed to my mother for convenience and tucked it into my desk where it belonged. And I unsubscribed from the cloud plans and streaming bundles that quietly linked our digital lives because I had been the one paying the bill and I was done being the invisible wallet that made family life look seamless online. Predictably, the responses arrived on schedule. My father first with a brisk refusal framed as principle, declaring that family does not send invoices and that if I wanted to talk about money we could talk about where he planned to leave his. An attempt at leverage that would have rattled me a year ago but now landed with a dull thud because the only inheritance I had ever received was the habit of swallowing hurt, while my mother wrote a long apology that apologized for how I felt without acknowledging what she and he had done, tucking in a plea for me to reconsider the tone because it made them look bad to the cousins who, she wrote, were asking questions I had started. And Emily sent a screenshot of a sympathetic comment thread calling me dramatic and selfish that she claimed she had not encouraged, which was a neat trick considering she was the one who had posted the caption about betrayal that made it all possible. I did not fight any of it. I replied once to each, copying the accountant again, and kept my words plain, that the ledger reflected adult costs and that the plan was simple, that I wished them well and would not participate in name-calling or negotiations by tantrum, and that 30 days of quiet would give everyone time to adjust to a new arrangement in which I was not their event staff. And, because I understand that absence cannot hold a boundary on its own unless you shore it up with something tangible, I took one more step that felt like a decision with a spine. Canceling the small custodial fund I had been contributing to for family celebrations and redirecting it through the accountant into a scholarship donation in my grandmother's name. A woman who had loved me without conditions and who would have laughed out loud at the idea that quiet competence meant you owed people everything. I ended the day by boxing up the last of the favors and craft supplies and custom label rolls that had colonized a corner of my closet in the name of family unity. Taping the lid shut and writing a note that I would leave the bin with the doorman for pickup on Saturday between noon and 2 if anyone wanted the materials for their next big moment, and then I powered my phone down for the first full night in months, knowing that the real storm would begin not because I had shouted, but because I had stopped answering, and just before sleep I remembered the envelope from the attorney that had arrived a week earlier with my name on it and a small handwritten line about documents my grandmother had filed the year before she passed. An envelope I had set aside because there had never been time to open something that might change the way the family talked about fairness, and as the room finally settled around me I decided that tomorrow I would break the seal, because if there was one last move to make, I wanted to make it with my eyes open. I woke with that calm that comes when you know the worst shouting is over because you are no longer in the room where it happens, made coffee without checking my phone, and set the unopened legal envelope on the table like a small stone that might still sink the boat. Then I broke the seal and slid out a letter in my grandmother's looping hand along with a stack of documents that looked dry until you understood the power they carried, and as I read the first paragraph, her saying that if the family ever made me feel small, she wanted me to have something that did not require begging to be seen, I understood that she had not only been watching all along but planning. Because the papers named me successor trustee to a modest but sturdy fund she had built from life insurance and the sale of a piece of land, a fund that for years had quietly paid for the kinds of gatherings that my parents liked to pretend appeared by magic, with distributions left to the trustee's discretion and a clause that made me sit up straighter, which said that any use of the fund for celebrations required the trustee to certify that the family treated all grandchildren with equal consideration and respect. Language my grandmother wrote in her precise voice, so that no one could pretend they did not understand what equal meant when the bill arrived. I called the attorney whose note had accompanied the envelope and sat in her office that afternoon going line by line, and by the time I left we had prepared a simple notice to my parents and my sister that I had accepted the trustee role, that all discretionary disbursements were paused pending review of prior use under the Equality Clause, and that any future requests would require written statements addressing fairness, which was not revenge dressed up as policy, but policy that made the truth impossible to dodge, and, because I am done doing anything halfway, I also attached the ledger I had already sent, framing it not as a threat but as the first accounting in a family that had never once balanced its books when it came to me. When the notice went out, the reaction was immediate and unhinged in a way I could not have predicted even after a lifetime of living inside their entitlement. With my father emailing the attorney to accuse me of stealing what was his while copying relatives as if C.C. Fields could bend the law. My mother begging to meet in person so we could keep things private, and then announcing in the next sentence that the extended family had already been told I was unstable, and my sister sending a stream of messages that started with insults and pivoted seamlessly into requests for emergency releases for a honeymoon deposit because the vendor did not accept delayed dreams as currency, all of which I answered once, in writing, through counsel, with a sentence so plain it could not be misread, that the fund would no longer underwrite celebrations that required my silence to be profitable, and that any repayment owed to me would be handled through the accountant on a schedule that would not make anyone bleed, which triggered a new cycle of dramatics that spilled out of their phones and into my real life when they showed up at my building and tried to sweet-talk the doorman. Called my workplace after I had already told Human Resources to expect this and to direct any calls to legal, and pushed cousins to call me in a rotating chorus that was supposed to sound like concern yet kept drifting back to whether I could please make an exception just this once so that nothing looked messy. I did not meet them in the lobby, and I did not take the bait, because the point was not to flip the table in public, but to finally remove the legs they had rested on. So I signed the final instructions at the bank to stop automatic disbursements from the trust to the event coordinator my parents loved, and I filed the scholarship paperwork the attorney had drafted in my grandmother's name so that a portion of the annual proceeds would go to girls who carried more than their share without Applause, and I sent a closing note to the family list that did not gloat and did not scold, but did land like a door, telling them that I wished them peace and that I would be available for a conversation only after three things happened. That the repayment plan began without theatrics, that the public stories smearing me were corrected with the same energy used to launch them, and that a written commitment to equal treatment going forward was signed by the three of them without caveats, and, until then, I would be living my life without their hands in my pockets or their expectations on my back. The days that followed were loud on their side and quiet on mine, a swirl of accusations that I had turned cold and then, predictably, offers of compromise that boiled down to a request that I put everything back the way it was so they could feel calm again. But the power of a boundary does not come from how loudly you announce it, it comes from what you no longer do when it is tested, and I did not move, which is when the tantrum lost oxygen and the silence finally arrived, a silence that was not punishment, but proof that I had changed the weather in the only house that had ever mattered. Weeks later, the accountant forwarded the first installment with a one-line note that simply said progress. The attorney confirmed that the scholarship endowment was in motion. And a cousin sent me a screenshot of a new caption under a family photo that said people grow when they listen, which I did not take as an apology so much as an acknowledgement that the ground had shifted and they knew it. And while part of me waited for the familiar rush of guilt to come back and ask whether I had gone too far, it never arrived, replaced by a steady sense that I had finally solved the problem without burning the map, because I did not demand contrition, and I did not need a grand reconciliation. I only asked them to live with their math and with the rule my grandmother set down in her careful hand, that love is not measured by the size of the party if one child never gets a candle. If you want the final twist, it is not dramatic in the way people on the internet like to consume. It is me going for a long walk on a Saturday and not worrying that my phone will erupt with somebody else's emergency. It is me answering an email from the scholarship coordinator who tells me a first-generation student cried when she learned books were covered. It is me tucking my grandmother's letter into a frame and placing it where I can see it, and it is me leaving one last message in the family thread that says I am open to a real conversation when you are ready to treat me like a whole person until then the keys are back where they belong and the lights stay off unless you pay the bill, which is not cruelty and not revenge for the sake of it, but the clean end of a plan that finally made sense, because I did not need them to love me loudly. I needed them to understand that there is no celebration worth having if the price is someone's silence, and I am done offering mine.